There is a saying, proper preparation and planning prevents peaceful performance, also known as the 7 Ps. In 1939, the Imperial Japanese Army proved this to be true by winning a battle against an overwhelming enemy armored force without a single tank of their own. At the heart of this preparation was a small bottle of soft drink. The story starts along the China-Mongolia border near the town of Nomonhan. In the first part of the 20th century, this wilderness was inaccurately mapped. There was a small patch of land that both the Japanese client of Manchuria and the Soviet client of Mongolia claimed. The competing claims would lead to 5 months of fighting between Russian and the Japanese. The Japanese named this war after the town closest to the border, Nomonhan, while the Soviets named it after the river in the area, Khalkhin Gol. Hello and welcome to another Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. I'm your host, Tony, and today I will be covering the Japanese Kaenbin anti-tank bottles, an improvised weapon used in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. If you like our videos and want to support us, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to improve future Tank Encyclopedia content. Any help would be greatly appreciated. One of the units swept up in this escalation of forces was the veteran and fully motorized 26th Regiment, commanded by the competent Colonel Shinichiro Sumi. When his regiment arrived at the logistic base at Hailar on the 22nd of June, Colonel Sumi dispatched officers to visit the various units that had already been in combat and find out more details about what facing the Russians would be like. It is almost certain that these officers would have encountered stories of the Soviets' tanks, the PT-5 and PT-7. At the time, the Japanese infantry would have had what they termed rapid-fire infantry guns, but today we would recognize them as the 37mm anti-tank guns. These would, of course, wreck the lightly armored PT tanks. However, the 26th Regiment had none of these weapons. Indeed, it was extremely short of heavy weapons, having just 6 machine guns and an equal number of battalion guns. It is quite possible that, during these investigations, the officers would have interviewed Private First Class Okano Katsuma from the 23rd Division. During the skirmishes in May, he, along with 2 other men, were assigned as truck drivers to help bring supplies forward. During one such trip, they were chased by a Russian tank. In desperation, Private First Class Katsuma started to throw cans of petrol off the back of the truck in an attempt to impede the pursuing Soviet tank. Much to the soldiers' surprise, when the tank hit one of these cans, it burst into flame, allowing them to escape. The idea of petrol as a weapon against tanks and AFVs was not entirely new to the Japanese. Major Nishiura Susumu had been an observer during the Spanish Civil War and had seen the combatants using wine bottles filled with petrol to attack armored vehicles. In July 1937, he had sent a report back to Japan. This was seen with incredulity by the Ordnance Bureau. However, Major Susumu's insistence convinced them to conduct trials. These failed utterly. In the cold Japanese weather, the stationary tanks stubbornly failed to burst into flames. Thus, the Ordnance Bureau concluded there was nothing to this idea. Back at the supply base supporting the Japanese efforts, Colonel Sumi had no other ideas to help defend his soldiers from tanks, and he had been ordered to move forward to the front. When the regiment marched out, he left behind 2nd Lieutenant Negami Hiroshi from the regiment's quartermaster detachment. He had orders to secure as many bottles as he could from the army supply chain and ship them to the regiment via truck. Lieutenant Hiroshi found the supply dump stocked with thousands of bottles of soft drinks, and he immediately attempted to requisition these. He obtained around 1,200 bottles and shipped them to the regiment. The supplies caught up with the soldiers at Changchunmiao. Trials were held to determine the best way of creating the weapon. It was determined the best design was to fill the bottle about 1/3 with sand to give it ballast and the ability to be accurately thrown, and the rest topped off with petrol. complete the weapon, a small wad of cotton, taken from the soldier's rifle cleaning kit, acted as a bottle stopper and fused when lit. This weapon was named Kaenbin. There was still one unsolved flaw. The flat open countryside often had a strong wind blowing, which made lighting even something like a cigarette difficult, if not impossible, let alone having to light the wick in battle. Lieutenant Hiroshi had acquired enough drink to provide one bottle to every man in the regiment, including Colonel Sumi. Starting on the 1st of July, the Japanese launched their counter-offensive. They were to cross the Halha River at its narrowest point. Forces would hold the bridgehead, and the 26th Regiment in its trucks would push round behind the Soviet forces and encircle them, at the same time overrunning the large Russian artillery reserves that had caused so many casualties in the first 2 months. Like so many plans from the Japanese command structure, this plan was powered by no small amount of delusion, ignoring some very critical problems that the command structure simply ignored. The foremost of these was the pontoon bridge to be used to cross the river. It was the only pontoon bridge that the Japanese had in all of China, and it dated from 1900. The infantry crossing the bridge had to take off their packs. Only one truck was allowed on the bridge at any time, and that had to be unloaded first. Even with these precautions, the bridge still took damage, and so crossing had to be halted every 30 minutes to repair the structure. It is no surprise that, by the morning of the 3rd of July, only one of the 26th Regiment's 3 battalions was across the river, along with the 71st and 72nd Regiments to hold the bridgehead. The choice was simple: attack with one battalion or wait for all 3 to cross. It will come as no surprise that the Japanese chose to attack. Colonel Sumi ordered his men to cross in boats as fast as possible to join the defense as the lead battalion began its attack. Faced with the Japanese bridgehead, the Russians reacted immediately. Elements of the 36th Motorized Rifle Division were based at Tamzak. These were the 11th Tank Brigade, 7th Motorized Armored Brigade, and the 24th Motorized Rifle Regiment. In total, they had 186 tanks and 266 armored cars. These were ordered forward to assault the Japanese position. These required a long fast road march in the baking sun and 40 degrees Celsius heat. The Soviet armor surrounded the Japanese bridgehead and began probing attacks, while the main column, in no formation, plowed straight into the lead battalion of the 26th Regiment. The terrain of the battlefield was utterly flat and desolate. There were no features, trees, or bushes to hide behind, just endless flat, soft, sandy soil with very short grass. In such a situation, the tanks should have obliterated the Japanese infantry caught out in the open. The 71st and 72nd Regiments had access to rapid-fire infantry guns, as well as the 13th Field Artillery Regiment, armed with modern Type 90 75mm guns. Thus, they were able to hold off most of the attacking tanks. Where these guns or Kaenbin were not available, the infantry resorted to Nikuhaku Kogeki, human bullet, attacks. In these, the infantry would hold their ground until the target tank was within about 40 meters, then leap up and charge at the tank. The infantry would swarm the tank, attempting to wrench open hatches or cause damage with grenades. Soviet tanks would hose their colleagues down with machine gun fire, or if the crew was quick enough, they could rotate their turret at full speed, throwing the Japanese soldiers off. At the 26th Regiment, they had no rapid-fire infantry guns. Their only support was from 12th Type 38 75mm regimental guns. As the tanks bowed towards the 26th Regiment, these guns opened fire at a range of 1500 meters, but were largely ineffective. At 800 meters, the handful of Type 90 70mm battalion guns the regiment owned opened fire, but these could only score a hit with about a third of their shots and were also largely ineffective. At 500 meters, the few HMGs the regiments owned opened fire. As there was no Russian infantry, these machine guns aimed for vision slits and also had no effect. Then the tanks reached 40 meters, and the Nikuhaku Kokeki teams began to attempt to light their Kaenbin. The harsh wind kept preventing ignition. As a tank bore down on him in desperation, one soldier hurled his unlit bottle. It smashed on the armor of the tank. To everyone's surprise, the tank burst into flames. Eyewitness accounts describe how a tank struck by a Kaenbin burned. The bottle would shatter, the gasoline contents would splatter quickly, and the sheet of fuel would ignite in the heat of sun and the vehicle. Flames would appear from the bottom of the tank, the way newspaper burns, giving the impression the ground was on fire. When the flames licked the top of the tank, the fire would subside with a puff, for the fuel tank had been entered. Now the inside of the tank would catch fire and burn furiously. The suggestion by surviving soldiers was that the heat radiating off the armor plate was sufficient to ignite the fuel. However, the accounts miss a few important details. First, from the information we have on ammunition usage, it seems each of the tanks destroyed by Kaenbin were hit by multiple bottles, on average approximately 3 each, although an accurate figure is hard to determine. This would mean that the tank would be absolutely drenched in petrol seeping into every opening, especially the engine bay. Here there are several possible means to ignite the fuel, such as the exhaust, which would be running at several hundred degrees from the long hard drive. Equally, the hours of driving in the extreme heat would have meant the transmission in the tank was scaldingly hot. In the swirling dust, heat haze, and smoke-shrouded battlefield, confusion reigned supreme. However, it was a situation the Japanese were ideally suited to. Any officer or NCO would take charge of the men around him, indicate a target, and would be hit by a volley of Kaenbin. Even Colonel Sumi was directing and organizing his soldiers. The Russian tankers were largely ignoring the infantry, trying to concentrate their fire on the support weapons that the Russians assumed to be wreaking so much havoc on their armored force, when it was the infantry who were the main threat. As the battle progressed, some Russian tankers abandoned their vehicle before they were hit, attempting to flee on foot. Those crews that had bailed from burning tanks were also trying to retreat to friendly lines. They had to endure the attention of the Japanese heavy machine guns. However, the Japanese were not having it all their own way. Casualties were mounting, and on a few occasions, poor coordination between the battalion guns and the infantry meant that Nikuhaku Kokeki teams were killed by friendly fire. By 1500 that afternoon, mere hours after the attack was launched, the Russians withdrew. As they pulled back, they left a field of burning vehicles. That evening, Colonel Sumi tallied events. The regiments had claimed 83 tanks knocked out, although Colonel Sumi reckoned this involved some overclaiming. He calculated that the total was around 70. The force as a whole had knocked out some 280 to 230 AFEs from the attacking Russians. However, the Japanese force was spent. It had taken about 10% casualties and was all but out of ammunition. For example, the 26th Regiment could find just 36 Kaenbin. The lead battalion had no ammo left for its battalion guns. The other 2 battalions only had 1 serviceable guns each, with just 1 box of ammunition left. With no hope of resisting the following day, and with Russian artillery coming more into play, the Japanese began to withdraw. However, through miscommunication, the lead battalion of the 26th Regiment did not get the message until too late and took even heavier casualties. Like many of the Japanese plans for this campaign, the attack was overly ambitious. This overconfidence and lack of ability from the chain of command would lead in September to the total destruction and utter victory by the Soviets. Even in the last days of the fighting at Nomonhan, the Japanese reported that Russian tanks had tarpaulins strapped over their rear decks to render the Kaenbin ineffective. The Kaenbin, or some other variant of the idea, would see service in the latter part of the Second World War. Once again, the Japanese would face a superior armored force in the shape of the Allies. A standard part of the Japanese anti-tank tactics was the Kaenbin. Japanese anti-tank tactics called for an ambush, preferably where terrain limits the mobility of the tank and slows it down. In an ideal engagement, the tank supporting infantry would be pinned or forced to withdraw. Then, the tank would be immobilized by mines or whatever was on hand. Then, the crew of the tank would be forced to dismount. One such tactic suggested for this was to attack the tank with Kaenbin, although other weapons such as the Type TB gas grenade could be used. With the tank unmanned and immobilized, it could be destroyed or booby-trapped at leisure by engineers. Of course, if it was the only weapon the Japanese infantryman had, he would go straight to the attack with the Kaenbin, although success was unlikely. And that's it for this video. If you liked it, please leave a like and subscription. You can find more information relating to these bottles in the full article, which is linked in the description. If you like what we are doing and want to let us continue working on these videos, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be allocated to improving our articles and videos for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.